right. Well, we're a few minutes past the hour, so I think we might as well go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for adding yourselves to the attendee list. Let me go ahead and it just always makes me so happy when I see someone's pets. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing, but I can fix that because the host is on my other computer. One sec.
Is this self-hosting?
One sec. All right, that should do it. Let me share here. Yep, there we go. And I want to share just that window. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm scanning through the attendees. Let's see here. Do we have anyone? Is this your first or second meeting or GitBOM meeting?
It's my first.
Oh, welcome, Andrew. I think we may have been chatting on Twitter. Welcome. Would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. So Andrew Lillybrinker, he, him, and I work at MITRE.
Awesome. Thank you for all your security vulnerability email things. I get them a lot, or CVSs. Cool. Well, welcome, Andrew. Is there anyone else? I'm seeing familiar faces for the most part. All around me are familiar faces.
I completely agree with the choice of music.
Yeah, great one. Both the original and the cover from Johnny Darko. All right. Well, as a quick reminder to all, please start reaching out to language and build tool communities. Let me pull this up. And let's check if there are any updates on this. Go ahead, DPP. And please, because it's hard for me to see when I share my screen, please use the hand raising feature. But DPP, David, you happen to be on my screen, so go ahead.
So I reached out through some Microsoft contacts to the OpenJDK team at Microsoft, and we're going to have a call probably the first or second week of June to discuss how we can get GitBOM support within Java-C and within any of the jarring tools.
Awesome.
And once we figure out a time where the Microsoft people can make it, you know, and anybody in this community who wants to attend is more than welcome, and I'll post stuff in our Slack channel.
Fantastic. And just a quick note, Andrew, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I know I reached out to you with regards to a specific project you were working on. Do you mind just mentioning it to us really quickly?
Sure, yeah. So the thing I'm working on is called Cargo SPDX. It's a custom subcommand for the cargo build tool for Rust that is intended to generate an SPDX SBOM for a crate. So you know, basically crates have a lot of the metadata that you would need for an SBOM already. And so rather than making anyone go through the process of building it, just sort of grab all of that, and you have to prompt for a little bit, but generate an SBOM is the basic idea.
That is awesome. We are very, very glad to have you here. I saw DPP was having much happiness as you described Cargo SPDX.
Sure, and I can drop a link to the repo as well.
Perfect.
Yep. I mean, also feel free if you want to add it under the sort of new topics as a link in the agenda. That's also a good place. People do sometimes go back through the meeting minutes because we often have exceptionally good meeting minutes as open source communities go. So if you want to just go ahead and add it under the build tool community outreach stuff as a sub bullet, that is fantastic.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm continually stunned how good our meeting minutes are. This is not something open source communities do well usually.
Speaking of who's taking the minutes for this meeting, I just realized, is that supposed to be me or is that
It would be impressive if it was you, but that would be asking a lot. Running a meeting and taking minutes at the same time is an extraordinary skill.
Yeah, I don't know if I can dual wield that as much.
I mean, I think we often get a lot of assistance from folks as we go along.
That's true. Yep. So yeah,
Well-
people could fill in the minutes, which are in the doc. I'll go ahead and repaste the link in chat just in case. There we go. And I noticed we had a person join. Marcos, hello.
Hello. Hello, Neil. Hello, everyone. I'm new to the team. I was invited by Ed. Hello, Ed. And also by Barati. I'm from Cisco.
Welcome. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right. So reviewing from last time, we have the GitOID URI proposal. It looks like this was merged in.
Yeah, so the only reason I added this to the agenda is to let everyone know that we are now actually officially registered with IANA, which is the next bullet point down.
Cool.
And so for folks who may or may not have kept up with this, because we use GitOids, we had questions from folks like SPDX about how would we represent GitBOM identifiers as URIs. We were looking at how to put together a URI, and what we finally settled on was to say, well, rather than doing our own bespoke thing, wouldn't it be better to just get a URI for Git object IDs in general that anybody could use who needs to talk about Git object IDs? And so that's what we have here.
That is awesome. And that is a big step. Sweet.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We're moving on to the next agenda, the spec scope proposal. I remember looking at this pull request recently.
Yeah, so I think I settled all of the comments except for one. And I just wanted to sort of take a quick straw poll about how folks thought about it, because I sort of looked at it and I'm like, I'm not even sure what my opinion is, but it was this whole discussion about relationships in the graph. So relationships between artifacts and or graph relationships between artifacts. We had some folks who wanted to talk about it in terms of parent-child relationships, or more specifically as GitBOM ADG nodes. And it struck me as the sort of thing that would be worth having a brief conversation about to see if there were opinions before we resolved it. And let me go ahead and stick the link to that into the chat as well, just so folks can get to it. And there we go. And for those of you who are newer, the thing we're trying to settle out here is the spec directories where we're trying to write a spec, and we've borrowed a template for this. And one of the things one needs to specify in the template is the scope of the spec, so that people know what the scope of the work is. And it's related to things like licensure and whatnot. And so we've taken the effort to get this pretty much right, well, as close to right as we can. And we're almost there, I think. But we just had this one set of comments that I didn't feel good about closing things out without letting folks weigh in as to which way they wanted to go.
This is something I personally don't have really strong feelings about, but I'm wondering if anyone else has an opinion on this or has some thoughts to add.
So I think if we're speaking in terms of a graph, that talking about parent-child, maybe is unclear. I know that because I looked through one of the previous recordings for a previous meeting, and I know that there was discussion of transitioning away from tree, and it seems like maybe the parent-child thing is kind of a leftover artifact from that. I also see, so there's a comment from Jeff about sort of expanding, so you have like relationships between artifacts, but then also being inclusive with that definition of relationships between like non-artifact things, the graph itself, things within the graph. I wonder, would that be a separate bullet point, say like relationships between artifacts, and then have a separate bullet about relationships between non-artifact things, or is it?
So I think we have. So I think we have some stuff. Let me sort of find where this is in the broader document. I believe we have a bullet where we talk about guidance on metadata, which references artifact dependency graphs, because it's the expectation is there's going to be a ton of interesting metadata that people will want to use to refer into the graph, because once you have a sparse graph that anybody can point at, lots of interesting use cases suggest themselves. And there's some wisdom we might be able to impart by offering guidance there. But I don't think we, at this time, anticipate specifying that here. I mean, I think we all have like really, really fun ideas about where people could go with it. But one of the things that we've tried to do historically is to keep this very tight, so that it's simple for build tool implementers, and also so it leaves maximal space for other people to innovate.
Yeah. Yeah. So perhaps over-specifying wise. Yeah.
For me, at least, it's a state of constant concern about over-specifying. So, because I'm like everybody else, I have all kinds of cool ideas for things I'd like to do with it.
So I've got a question, and this is because of one of my deficiencies. In general, thinking about structures and metadata and where, graphy things, I often have to actually build something and see where like things either work or don't work before finalizing ideas. Can we maybe call this a draft, pending some actual code and that sort of thing? And that might help us, kind of say, look, here's an open issue that we can resolve post-draft. I mean, does that sound like a reasonable approach?
Go ahead, Ed. Oh, I'm sorry.
Ava's hand was
Ava
up first.
Sorry, the hand was blending in there. Go ahead, Ava.
So I would suggest that the scope and the actual spec, David, I feel you. When I'm writing the spec, I also need to have running code, and that's sort of also how the IETF has always been fashioned. Specs are in draft form until there's, multiple instances of running code and rough consensus. I think we're a long way from there, but for the scope, I think that's how we start out. Sort of, let's draw the general outline of this thing and say it's somewhere in this space. We're not sure what it looks like exactly yet, but we know it's in this sandbox, and that sandbox is square, not triangle. It has 4 sides at least. So I think there's some value in the graph versus parent-child discussion, but not a ton of value, which is why I prefer, as my comment there says, I prefer graph because it's less specific. It describes the overall shape without prescribing or limiting us from there on. Parent-child is a subset of graph.
I tend to also prefer graph for similar reasons. That and Jeremy has, with exceptional good manners, beaten tree out of me.
Again, tree is a type of graph.
It was like a dagger through my heart. So it sounds like the consensus is on the existing text for drafts. Does anyone have any issues then with going ahead and merging the scope? Because I think we've sort of, other than this comment, I think we've beaten it to death.
I'm okay with merging as it is. Does anyone have any objections to that? Ava, do you still have your hand up, or is it a? Oh, okay.
It's a legacy hand.
It's a legacy hand.
I don't like you referring to it as being beaten to death.
Very good point, Wayne. I appreciate that.
I will try and take that feedback in the spirit of my ongoing endeavor to use less violent metaphors.
We've
I was
painted
referring
that
to my
shed.
I was referring to my last name, but
Oh,
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Joke.
yeah, I guess the delivery was off. Anyway, sorry, carry on. Just wanted to contribute something.
I don't know if there was also a stick in a tree joke in there someplace.
Someone who is not me would like to merge since I authored the PR. Please feel free.
Well, we have, I've heard no objections here, so I will go ahead and let's double check, because there are multiple open suggestions here that all of these should be either accepted or rejected. So let's do the quick busy work or manual labor of closing some of these suggestions, and then I'll merge it.
Okay, that's fine.
So the first one that I see is replace graph with parent child. I do not want to add that. How does that get rejected? Oh, I can delete it, but that's probably not the right thing to do.
you can resolve the conversation.
This is where,
Yeah, and the other conversations have been resolved because the vast majority of them were people very kindly and sweetly correcting my abysmal tendency towards typos.
Okay, well, why don't we keep doing that async, and
Okay.
let's go ahead and check out the next topic, which is consent rule of two, handles SHA-1 and SHA-256 GitOIDs using. It sounds like we have had a consensus. I remember we discussed this at our last meeting on dual parallel trees.
Yeah, and just a quick synopsis for folks who weren't part of that previous conversation. Basically, a number of folks have raised the fact that GitOIDs are currently in common practice, rooted in SHA-1 as a matter of some concern. The Git community itself has implemented in Git the ability to use SHA-256 based GitOIDs, although its adoption is minuscule at this time. And so in sort of hashing through the problem and also thinking about future proofing as the world moves on from both of those, it seemed best to follow what we refer to as the rule of two. There was always, always two of them. It's sort of a SIFI rule, but so we will have a tree that is entirely a GitOID SHA-1 tree, and a tree that is entirely a Git 256 GitOID tree, a SHA-256 GitOID tree, and we will do both of them completely independently from one another in parallel to sort of dispel any concern about SHA-1 while maintaining the backward lookup towards what's really in source repos.
Sounds good, and I look forward to not getting looked at like I have horns on my head when I bring up SHA-1 as our standard here, because now we have two. Cool. Any other comments on this?
I actually, well, let me raise my hand.
You can go ahead.
Just the last meeting, which I didn't attend, where this was discussed, Ed graciously said, let's wait for DPP, because he had a separate proposal, which was merging mashing the two hashes together. After listening to the recording, I withdrew my other proposal and formally endorsed this one. Sorry for the saying all the words, but I just wanted to make it very clear that I do endorse this.
Excellent.
Clarity is good, and we appreciate it. Sorry, Ed, were you going to say something?
I was going to make generally positive noises, but nothing substantive.
Okay, cool. All right. Looks like we have another link under that, distinguishing between artifact ID types in GitBOM Docs.
So this was since we had consensus on dual tree, it begged a certain number of questions that we needed to be able to answer so that people can actually reasonably implement this. And one of them is, if we're now going to have two different flavors of GitBOM Docs, or in fact, as time evolves, we'll have more than two, right? But we have basically the SHA-1 GitOID and the SHA-256 GitOID, and never the twain shall meet. How do you tell which one is which? Was sort of one of the immediate questions that came to mind. And so I thought through a bunch of approaches that occurred to me. please note if people have other ideas, those are super welcome as well, and laid them out in some of the pros and cons just to see what folks' thoughts were. And I'll go ahead and stick the link to that also in the chat so people can review for themselves. Yeah, the couple of other things under this bullet point were okay, now that we've decided on dual tree, what else do we have to figure out?
So given that
So-
the intent is that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Andrew, and then we'll go to David.
Sure. So given with the dual tree decision that, there's not sort of intermingling of SHA-1 and SHA-256 hashes together, the header one seems, I don't know, the most sensible to me. I think the length, sort of choice is kind of fun and like works with the current, fact that these two hashes are different lengths. But like you say, in the trade-offs description, if there's ever a future situation where you have hash options with the same length, then it doesn't really work anymore, and you have to disambiguate. So, yeah, I think it's kind of annoying to have a header that you have to then sort of separately parse instead of just having every line be the same kind of format of record. But I mean, I don't think it's that terrible, and like there are CSVs that handle that, and people seem to do well enough with it. So I don't know, I'm kind of in favor of the header, I think.
Go ahead, David.
This is maybe a little bit orthogonal, but thinking about how this also plays into Perl, the package URL spec, I think would be useful. And, can we simply just have a GitBOM Perl, if GitBOM, if our URL or URI scheme just works, will it work with Perl? Or can we enhance Perl to support it? And I think that goes into the SHA-1 versus SHA-256 designation in the URL.
So I've added that as a new conversation note. If folks have things they want to discuss specifically about that now, that would be fine. But otherwise, would you mind if we put that in the new conversation file?
Yeah, let's put it in the new conversation file. I just, yeah, it was a random neuron firing. And you can always tell me to shut up when I have random neuron firings.
No, I think it's a good neuron. We like your neurons. We're fond of them.
All right, looking at it, I admit I do like the simplicity of being able to just look at the artifact ID and see what SHA it was. But I can very much see the argument for doing it as a doc header to reduce the length of it and to account for the fact maybe someday somewhere we'll have hashes that are the same length but are different hashing algorithms. Thank you, Elliot.
So I will point out one of the other things, and I think I mentioned the magic string thing under the header. I actually sort of, as I was doing this, I was in parallel trying to write a tool that could essentially go searching through trees to resolve GitBOMs to the underlying files in your file system. And file magic is lovely when you're doing that kind of thing. When you're trying to figure out, is this thing an artifact that I need to try and unpeel? Is this thing a GitBOM document? In which case, that's what it is. And so there's a lot to be said for magic numbers or magic strings at the beginning of files. As much as it slightly offends my aesthetics to have a file header and something that could have been simpler, there's a lot of power in that.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, my bias is repetition. So if we repeat information as much as possible, first of all, it makes it easier for humans to disambiguate if you're opening a file in a text editor. It means that tooling doesn't have to have secret stuff in it. And the other thing is that this sort of information compresses very well. So even though there's a lot of text repetition, when you're archiving something or compressing it or whatever, the repeated strings will compress very well.
So I think this is you advocating for distinguish by artifact ID URI?
Yeah.
Got it. So basically having every artifact ID URI carry the scheme header with it. Every hash carry the scheme header with it so that we can actually bring those along.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
There's something to say for parity checking.
Yeah, well, I guess the other thing that's interesting is at some point, if SHA-1 is deprecated and we have, foobar SHA or whatever comes after SHA-256, it'll be easy to write scanning tools to say, okay, who's still doing SHA-1 only, or who's still emitting SHA-1? And, just being able to scan or grep or use standard text tools to be able to search through swaths of things tends to make those swaths of things easier to manage.
That's true, but as an unrepentant grepper, I know that basically one of the things that I would expect people looking for that to be interested in knowing which GitBOM documents contain a SHA-1 GitOID, not which entries in which GitBOM documents, generally speaking. You would identify the documents in question. So if we put this as if we put this as a header on each hash, then I'm going to get a line for basically every single line in the GitBOM document. Now I can solve that by typing some awk together with some sort-u, and my fingers are accustomed enough to it that it's not a big deal. But it took years to get to the point where that was a non-thinking process for me. And so I can imagine people who are just grepping might find the repetition annoying as they're trying to grep to find where the GitBOMs are that are SHA-1.
Could we potentially use a different header or at the top of the file to identify it as a GitBOM file?
I'm certainly open to other ideas. That, to be very, very clear, other ideas delight me.
Is there art that we can draw on elsewhere, either within how extensions to do things, or other things that are kind of putting a lot of metadata around in a file system? For example, email messages and IMAP servers typically have a one-to-one mapping between email messages and a file, and the beginning of the email message is a ton of headers. I don't know. I'm grabbing for straws here.
I'm going to start grepping about this direction if we don't stop.
We could, defer this, and people can fill in comments on the whatever this is, pull request, or this is an issue, and continue the conversations.
This is an issue because it turns out that certain kinds of things are harder to discuss in the pull request.
True.
And so for some of those, I've done issues instead.
Elliot, you've turned on your camera.
Yeah, I like the idea of ruminating actually on these things. Sometimes, I don't know if this is your experience. My experience is sometimes a little bit of additional conversation around other issues sometimes surfaces the right answer on this one. And I don't know what the dependent issues will surface, but we'll learn as we go on. So I like the idea of just leaving this for a little bit.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I do like ruminating. The other thing just to point out is we do have tool implementers on the call. And so, if the tool implementers have thoughts or opinions, it would be certainly very interesting to know them, since a lot of the things that occur to me as I'm writing code. And so I imagine they've got more than a little bit of code under their fingernails on these topics.
For the Rust implementation, I think we could take either of these approaches fairly straightforwardly.
For the LLVM also, I think either of them are fairly takes the same effort to implement. But I think adding the SHA-1 or SHA-2 identifier would help, especially if you're embedding it in the .bomb section, because it'll just be 2 strings, and you'll have to every time when you need to read that to parse, to prepare, at the time of link, you're looking at different object files and looking at that section, and instead of having to check every time, invent a logic to check whether it is this hash or that hash, it's just simpler if that is just embedded in that line, because it's only 1 line per section, right? And if you're going to add multiple hash line entries to it, it might be simpler to just have an identifier to say, okay, is this hash coming from SHA-1 or SHA-2 or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So I know that there's a follow-up issue that talks about sort of what section identifiers to use. Mm-hmm. And so that's very interesting on the section identifiers. I am a little bit lost though as to which of the current proposals, or if you're suggesting a new proposal, you think would be easiest between sort of the distinguish by artifact length. It sounds like you're talking about the artifact, either distinguish by artifact ID URI or distinguish by GitBOM doc header. But I couldn't tell which necessarily of those two you favor.
I do not think we need a different header or a section for this, right? It could just be one .gitbom section or .bomb section, which contains all the necessary information instead of having multiple sections.
Absolutely, and that gets to the which section, how do we handle sections in ELF files, which is the next issue. So, but the one we just left was GitBOM, how to express which type of GitBOM document we're dealing with.
Maybe I'm looking at
we had just come from 15, issue 15, and you seem to be having, excellent discussion about issue 16, which is where we were heading next.
Okay. Sorry about that.
It's okay. No, there's an important set of issues, and it's actually gratifying because it tells me that we've correctly anticipated one of the next things you're going to care about as a tool builder.
All right, well, that provides, I think, an excellent transition into issue 16. I'm keeping an eye on time. We're doing okay so far, but let's go ahead and review this one. Ed, do you mind introducing it?
No, I'm perfectly happy to. So this is exactly to the point that that I think Bharathi was making, which is, okay, this is great, but if we're running dual parallel trees, how then do we decide to embed them into an ELF section, right? Because previously we've been having a single section .bomb, and it just contained the GitOID SHA-1 for the GitBOM document. And when you introduce dual trees, now you have to sort of ask yourself, okay, how do we embed this into the output artifact in a way that we can tell what's going on? And so I sort of put together, and I'll stick in. So you had a question, Ellie, about today or future. Do you want to say a bit more about that real quickly?
Oh, no, I was answering Nell on that point. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry. So I just stuck the link to in for number 16. Effectively, I saw 3 ideas occur to me, and this is by no means the full enumeration of possible ideas. So definitely open to others. But the first one was basically we can separate the ELF sections by putting the artifact ID URI scheme into as the name of the section. So dot whatever the artifact ID would be. So like this the scheme would be like dot gitbom :gitoid :blob SHA-1, or dot gitbom :gitoid :blob SHA-256 as an example. That was sort of the first thought. The second thought was very similar, which was to separate ELF sections by taking, again, the URI scheme and replacing the colon with a dot with a period, because that's more idiomatic to how ELF sections are typically named. And then the third thought was we could always just put multiple URIs, or basically multiple URIs with their scheme prefix into the .bomb ELF section, and put a new line terminator at the end of them. And that was sort of the third idea that occurred to me. There's certainly other ideas that can occur to people here. So please, if other folks have ideas, let me know. And I called out various of what I saw as the pros and cons of these approaches. But I'm sure that that list is not exhaustive.
I have a feeling this one's going to be another ruminate on this one, but does anyone have any thoughts on this immediately?
One question is, does it make sense to handle this through multiple GitBOM sections?
That was kind of what I was suggesting in the first two suggestions, was to have a separate section for each scheme type. So that, and I have a particular tendency to like that because it means that you've got a clean modularity between them.
Yeah, I
very
mean, I like
simple.
that too.
Good, you were saying, Bharathi?
Yeah, that keeps it very simple even at the implementation level, and it's the adding more stuff into the same section would mean you'll have to process each line differently. Whereas here, that if you want SHA-1, you go to this section. If you want a different hashing scheme, this is definitely very simple in terms of implementation. I can say that, and you don't have to mess with the existing implementation.
Yeah, the other thing I really kind of liked about it is I was looking at a situation where I was going to use plugins for certain purposes. And you could imagine wanting to let people write plugins for the particular OID type they wanted. And if two plugins have to coexist in a single section, that is an opportunity for immense comedy. But if you're a plugin that does, GitOID, SHA 1024, if you're just mucking with your own stuff, you don't have to know anything about anybody else.
David has his hand up.
So I think the last example you just gave, Ed, biases me towards having the line single section, the multiple GitBOM doc URIs in the BOM ELF section. Because if we have to think about a new section for each hash type, or if we come up with another, let's say we have a URI that's associated with what were the compilation flags. I don't know, I'm making some stuff up, but we might have other reference documents within the BOM section. If we have to go back and say, okay, we now have 4 sections, we now have 5 sections, rather than we're going to express each of these as a URI within the .bomb section. I don't know, it feels heavier weight to make the latter, the former change, whereas just adding another line into the BOM section seems lighter weight. And, all of this is modulo what Bharathi said about, the tool implementation, because the folks that are implementing the tools probably have a louder voice in this than others, because they're the ones that are going to be, doing the work.
Ava, go ahead.
So my concern with putting it all in one section is the plethora of tools that are going to need to be able to parse that in consistent ways, whether it's in ELF or in other packaging formats. And so having separate entries, say SHA-1, SHA-256, and et cetera, means if I write a tool that understands and knows to look for a SHA-1 ELF header, that's just going to work. Or it won't find its header, and we'll say, oh, there's no GitBOM here that I know how to read. If you put them all into the same header, that tool that might work today might be broken by the addition of some other entries in that same header section 5 years from now. And that is not ideal.
All right. Well, I think this is let's ruminate more and have more discussion in the issue.
Yes, but there's one more thing I want to shine folks' attention on as a light before we move on. and this is purely in line with rumination, but on the having separate ELF sections for each hash type, I have sort of two suggestions. We had to figure out how we're going to name them. And I have two suggestions for naming them. One is basically saying, okay, we're just going to put dot and the URI for the hash scheme. And the other is to do that game, but replace the colon with a dot in the name. And I have a couple of conversations there about some of the pros and cons there. And some of them have to do with the fact that we'd like to get maximum self-similarity to how we put these things into, for example, archives like AR or TAR or JAR archives or zip archives. And we previously talked there about when we had just the .bomb, it was a .bomb ELF section, and then it was a .bomb subdirectory when we were talking about being at an archive. And using a colon in a file path segment when you are on Windows, last time I checked, goes very badly. And when you are on POSIX, it works, but it's not very frequently done. And so if we were to try and keep self-similarity, that seemed potentially problematic. And so I called that out. But the other thing that I did want to call out here is if we use a prefix of .gitbom for this here, we had previously had discussions about tab completion for having .gitbom be the name of the directory in other situations. So I just wanted to point that out as people are thinking about the naming before we go off and ruminate.
That's a very good point. All right. In the interest of time, sorry, David, go ahead. And then in the interest of time, I am going to move us on to the next topic. But David.
Just on the tab completion thing, if we actually reversed it, so it'd be sha1.blob.gitoid.gitbom. I don't know. Anyway, just random.
I'm just laughing because of Java background. That's all.
All right. Well, thank you very much on this. Our next topic is GitBOM information persistence to file system. Only consider last commit. Okay.
That's since been fixed. This was done on top of the change that talked about artifact dependency graphs. So you can look at the whole PR now. It's been rebased.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And let me stick the link to that into the meeting minutes because we had really good comments coming into the PR live during the meeting last time, and that was actually epic. Mm-hmm. So if folks want to real-time comment on the PR as we go, that's a great idea.
Cool. All right, taking a look at this.
And part of the crux of this was previously we've been thinking about persisting to a subdirectory, like a .bomb subdirectory of whatever directory we were writing the artifact to. And having had the opportunity, because of some working with some of the tool building stuff of, for example, like looking at what this looks like in the Linux kernel, it introduces a scatter gather problem where suddenly you've got .bomb directories everywhere that you need to go gather up. And so it seemed like it might be a better idea to have something like an environment variable or perhaps a flag that was sort of a standard behavior that could be set that would determine where we were going to go and write these things. And it also slightly deals with the problem we were talking about in terms of tab completion when we had the discussion of whether to make that a .bomb or a .gitbom directory. Because then if you decide that you're going to set that to .gitbom, it's your own fault. So the tab completion's on you.
User beware. Yeah.
User beware. And I could also imagine in sort of like big build shops, because not a lot, big build shops basically saying we're just going to keep a giant directory full of these things as we go. And just write it all to the same place. We've all got it someplace convenient across different builds and possibly even across different code bases in some circumstances. And that would be very easy. And you could then just literally trigger your tool as to whether to output a GitBOM based on whether the GitBOM dir environment variable or flag is set. And so that was sort of the crux of a lot of what was being written here as a proposal. But I did want to sort of get other people's thoughts and opinions, particularly folks who are building tools, because tools sometimes have different idioms around these things as to whether you look for a flag or an environment variable and other sorts of stuff.
Environment, I mean, option I think would be a good idea. Environment variable, my only concern is oftentimes there is environment inadvertently set, and you don't realize when you're running the build that this variable is set. So options, I would prefer to just a command line option, so it's it's aware that in the command line that you are indeed piping all the output to that directory.
Go ahead, Ava. Oh, sorry, Ed. Ed, go ahead, and then Ava.
I was just going to make broadly approving noises. Go on.
Yeah, this is a different point entirely from the one Bharati just made. So feel free to wrap that up if there's more on that first. No, okay. Looking at line 152, thinking about what happens when we replace SHA-1 with something else. This does not specify which GitOID to use in a multi-tree.
That is a really good point.
I would assume both. It just needs to say that or something.
So that's actually a really good point, and I actually gave it some thought. It doesn't mean I got to a useful conclusion, which is if you look at sort of the where it says GitBOM dir /objects on line, the later part of line 52, and then it's got a piece that basically says the first two characters of the GitOID, and then the second piece says the rest of the GitOID. And I actually went to go take a look at how Git is doing this. And if you go and you do a git init with the right flags to make it a SHA-256 Git repo, and you try adding the Apache license, and you go look in the object dir, what you will discover is it follows this pattern. It's still the first two characters of the hash. It's just the rest of the characters are more. And
okay, cool.
So because this sort of nicely captures that and is likely to follow similar patterns if they adopt something new in the future, it seemed like a semi-future-proof way of expressing it, if perhaps one that is a little bit subtle and perhaps could benefit from examples.
Yeah, I don't know that it needs an example here, but I do think it'd be worth adding either a note or even just a comma divided section as to how this interacts with having a parallel tree, right? If you, for example, if a build tool persists GitBOM, comma, and supports multiple hash types, comma, something like that, to clarify that it should write out in this format for whichever SHA or SHAs or hashes that tool is supporting. And that the same pattern applies regardless of which hash function is used.
That's an excellent point. And there in the template we're using, there's a whole separate section for notes and examples. And so we definitely want to include something like that there.
Yeah, other than that, nothing else is jumping out at me.
All right. Well, it sounds like adding those notes or those comments is a good next step. And perhaps we could, oh, go ahead, Ed.
I do have one question for Bharathi, because I did want to sort of get to your point about flags versus environment variables, Bharathi, which is, I completely understand these sometimes environment variables are set inadvertently. But they also have the advantage of being sort of a fairly good cross tool approach to things. Meaning that if I set a GitBOM dir and I've got two different tools that are in my build process, I'm building some C with LLVM, and then I'm using JNI to put it into Java. You can imagine both of those tools picking up the same environment variable, whereas their flags are going to be entirely disjoint from each other. Now, one of the things you mentioned was about inadvertentness of this stuff. Would it perhaps be better if we sort of put the order of precedence in such a way that before the GitBOM dir, any tool-specific flag to specify the GitBOM dir is considered prior to the environment variable? And that way, if you're a tool, you can have your own flag, and we will respect that above the environment variable. But if that flag is not set, then we will just fall back to the environment variable.
Yes, I think that there should be one default. That's what you're mentioning, right? You have a default option and also a command line option, and set a precedence for one over the other. Or if one is not available, default to the other. Yeah, I will. I think we discussed about it before, and I had intended to check the sources to see if there is any precedence of one approach favored over the other. I will look at the existing LLVM options and see if there is any trend to this, and I will get back on that.
Yeah. So Wayne, do you happen to know, or does anybody else happen to know, the sort of conventions for something like Java C for this?
I want to say command line switches, but I can't be confident. I don't have enough insight.
Is it something you could go check with somebody about and see if they have thoughts or opinions?
I can certainly find out what ECJ does, but yeah, I'll see what I can figure out. Sure.
Sure, that would be very helpful. I know in my experience, at least with Go seems to favor environment variables. How does Rust feel about all these sorts of things?
It can do either, in my opinion. I've seen environmental variables used more, but I'm interested in what the other two Rustaceans on the call have seen. Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, so I think I've usually seen environment variables used more, particularly for something, I think in this case, like you're ideally trying to centralize this stuff, or sort of making sure that things all end up in the place you expect. And so the advantage of environment variables is that it's more of a sort of ambient thing that's just, you don't have to remember to specify it each time. And so where I've seen it is for things like that, use environment variables for something where it's going to more likely than not vary with each run of something, make that a command line argument.
That sounds consistent with my experience as well. All right. Well, we're starting to run short on time, so I'm going to bring the agenda back up. I'd actually, before we move on to the next topic and see what we can get through, I'd like to make a proposal. So we have a lot of things in here, Git confusion, hash fragility, et cetera, that time of call that we've talked about talking about, but we haven't gotten to yet. I'm wondering if it would make sense to do a special call next week and discuss all the topics that have been on the agenda, as in we're going to get to that, but have not gotten to it yet.
So I would want to check in with the tool builders, since typically next week would be a tech call, and see what their thoughts and feelings are. My sense is that the tools folks have slowed down a little bit, partially because they're waiting on some stuff from the spec folks. So since it's mostly time for the tool folks to talk, I'd be kind of curious what their opinion would be of doing so.
Nell, did you mean in addition to the tools call, or by replacing the tools call?
I would say we would start with the conversations at the very least. I don't know if it depends on how many tools demos there are. I don't know if we'll be able to get through all the demos after, but we could defer some to the following meeting if needed. But I would want to start with these topics at the next meeting, particularly the Git confusion. David.
So this is purely self-interest. Next week, I'm going to be in a lift during this call because I have to go to the DMV to register my car and do a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think these new conversations are super, super important. So maybe we can do the new conversations during the in 2 weeks and have the tools folks do whatever demos they're going to do next week. If the demos run short, maybe we start in on some of these topics. But once again, this is pure self-interest on my part. So, take that for what it's worth, which is very, very little.
The other one that I would actually throw out as slightly as a point of self-interest is if there are folks who would like to pick up and own leading the discussion of one of these topics, I would strongly, strongly, strongly encourage that. And we can go ahead and feel free to prepare whatever collateral, as much or as little as you would like for those discussions. But while I am perfectly happy to be drafting some of these things related to this stuff, everyone should always feel welcome to go ahead and draft up anything for the pieces they want to discuss. That would be most welcome.
That makes sense. So then the open question is next week or in 2 weeks?
You own the call, Nell. You make the decision.
Yes, I'm the decider. Let's do the normal demos at the start of the call next week. And then if we do get to some of these topics, that's great. If we don't, that's okay. And then dedicate the following week to these special topics if we don't get through all of them. Okay. Sounds good. We're at 11:59. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to thoroughly discuss any of the other topics on the agenda. We could defer them. Are there any that we could not defer for 2 weeks or 3 weeks? I don't even know at this point. Are there any that we could not defer for the time being?
Are any of the tool builder folks blocked on something specific?
No, I'm not blocked.
Okay. I think the other thing that I didn't see folks here from SPDX today, and I had missed my scheduled sync with Kate Stewart on that, but I have a call with her tomorrow. I'll get back to you on this. So the other pivot I would have in mind is if the SPDX folks are waiting on us for anything to add support either in 2.3 or 3.0 in their work, I would prioritize that if they have a deadline, but I don't know yet. So I'll find out and get back to you all.
Sounds good. All right. Well, with that, I think it's we're 1 minute over, so I think it's time to close the call. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Andrew, Marcos, welcome. We would love to have you at future meetings and continue these discussions together. So please come back. Yeah, if you
Yeah,
can.
this was good. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Nell. Bye,
Have
everybody.
a wonderful day.
Bye, y'all.